Okay, so the drama of Sefer Breshit comes to a close this week as we finish the book, and the last story in the book that really highlights how much is still not really resolved by the end of the book is that after Yaakov dies, Yosef's brothers come to him and offer themselves as slaves because they just don't believe that Yosef has really forgiven them, right? And I think we talked about this last year or 2 years ago, that the end of Breshit is really tragic in that sense, right? That as much as we tend to think about the emotional religious heroism of Yosef, that he really didn't hold a grudge against his brothers, and we like to think of the last 17 years of Yaakov's life as a peaceful time for the family. You discover that that's not really the case, that Yosef's life ends in tragedy, that as much as he tried, as much as he really, really, really forgave his brothers, they never fully believed that he forgave them, and therefore, they thought, whatever unity there was during those last 17 years, they thought it was only because Yaakov was alive and Yosef was respecting his father and wasn't going to kill them. Essentially, I think we talked about this last year, what Esav said about Yaakov, right? Remember, Esav says, I'll wait till my father dies, and the day that my father dies, I'll kill Yaakov. Right? So the brothers essentially imagine Yosef as an Esav figure, where maybe he respects his father and won't kill us as long as Yaakov is alive, but he really hates us. And Yaakov and Yosef never seems to really reintegrate, right? He lives in the palace in Ramses, and they live in Goshen, right? He's not really there. But then Yosef tells them that I really did forgive you. Like, I really did. I really, really did. And the reason he does, and this is really one of the key theological lessons of all of Tanakh, is that he understands that in the end of the day, it wasn't really the brothers that sent him down, it was God. But what does that mean? Right? What does it mean that God sent him down and therefore the brothers aren't responsible? Meaning they are responsible, right? They really are responsible in a very deep sense. They're responsible. They're the ones who sent him. I mean, they're the ones who, whatever way, whether you think that they actually sold him or you think like the Rashbam, they're responsible for him being sold by throwing him to the pit. What does it mean that they're not responsible? So one of the things that happens in Tanakh a lot is that Tanakh will tell you the proximate cause of what happens and then the deep theological cause of why something happens. So I was just learning with Yotam, right? Right at the beginning of Sefer Malachim, Shlomo fires Evyatar from being the Kohen Gadol. The proximate reason is because he had joined the coup of Adoniyahu. So when he's punishing all the allies of Adoniyahu, he wants to punish Evyatar, the Kohen Gadol, as well. But he doesn't want to kill Evyatar because he's the Kohen Gadol and because he was loyal to David in certain key times. So he compromises, and he says, I won't kill you, but I'm going to fire you so that you live out the rest of your life as a non-entity. Right? This way you're not threatening. That's the proximate cause of why he gets fired. But then the Navi says the real reason that he gets fired is because God had promised Eli that because Eli hadn't stopped the crimes of his sons, Chafni and Pinchas, the Kahuna Gedola would be stripped from the house of Eli. Right? And this is the fulfillment of the promise that God gave to Eli. Right? So there's a proximate political reason, and then there's the theological reason. What Yosef seems to be saying is not, you're not responsible in terms of your olam haba, in terms of your personal cheshbon with God. Obviously, they are. And obviously they are responsible. What Yosef is saying is, look, that's not my business. I am going to rise above it by looking at level 2 and saying that whatever your personal responsibility is, I am willing to understand and tap into the reality that there is a bigger story going on here, and I'm going to rise above it by focusing on that story. And from that perspective, maybe you're responsible. That's between you and God, but not between you and me. Because the fact that I ended up here was God's plan. And therefore, whether you had done it or not, so it would have happened one way or another. And therefore, you may be responsible. Take it up with God. But from my perspective, that's not my issue. And the Midrash in Vayeshev, and this is why I really want to sort of wrap it up, the Midrash in Vayeshev makes this point very powerfully, how this idea is really the connecting theme, at least in the Yosef story, from Vayeshev through Vayechi, but in many ways of the entire story. And I mentioned last week that I was going to try to quote at least one more thing from Aviva Zornberg. She makes a big deal of this midrash. So this is her translation of the midrash. It's Tanchuma Dalid in Vayeshev. Right, so Yosef was brought down to Egypt. This is an example of come and see the works of the God who was held in awe by men for his acts. Even the awesome, terrible things that you bring upon us, you bring through a plot, through an alilah. Come and see, when God created the world, from the first day, he created the angel of death, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and that is the angel of death, who darkens the faces of human beings. And Adam was created on the 6th day, and a pretext in Alilah was found to blame him for bringing death to the world. As it is stated, as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. This is like a man who wants to divorce his wife, and before going home, writes a bill of divorce. He enters his house with the divorce in his hand, and seeks a pretext in Alilah to give it to her. He asks her for a cup of beverage, and she pours it for him. He takes the cup from her. He says, here is your divorce. She says, what have I done wrong? He says, leave my house, for you have poured me a lukewarm drink. She says, but you knew that I would pour you a lukewarm drink, for you had already written the divorce bill and brought it in your hand. In the same way, Adam said to God, Master of the universe, before you created your world 2,000 years ago, the Torah was as a confidant with you. And in the Torah it is written, this is the ritual when a person dies in a tent, right? Paraduma. If you had not already planned death for your creatures, would you have written this in the Torah? But you came to me with a pretext to make me responsible for death. Terrible to man are your plots. God wanted to fulfill the decree, know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs. So he brought about the plot of all this narrative, so that Jacob should love Joseph, and his brothers should hate him and sell them to the Ishmaelim, who would bring him down to Egypt. Do not read, Joseph was brought down to Egypt, but Joseph brought his father and brothers down to Egypt. This is like a cow whose owners want to place a yoke on her neck. She refuses the yoke, so what do? They take her calf away from her, pull him to the field that they want plowed. The calf bellows for his mother, who hears and involuntarily follows her son. In the same way, God wanted to fulfill the decree of the covenant, the Brit Ben Abtarim, so he engineered the plot of this whole narrative, and the family went down to Egypt and paid off the writ. Terrible to men are your plots. Right, so this midrash is quite cynical in a certain sense, right? But it really does highlight how much this is this is the theology of the whole Torah. Right? God wanted there to be death, but instead of saying there'll be death, he said there won't be death unless you sin. And then he put Adam in a tempting situation. And as the Midrash imagines it, Adam turns to God and he says, what are you doing? You already knew that you wanted death. You already had laws planned in the Torah for death. You knew I was going to mess up. And the mashal that it gives is this husband who wants to divorce his wife, writes the divorce, comes, asks for a drink, knowing his wife is going to give him like a lukewarm drink just to sort of anger him, and uses that as a pretext to divorce. And the woman says, what are you doing? You wanted to divorce me anyways. And then the Torah says, and the Midrash says that's exactly what's going on here with Yosef as well, that God wanted to fill the Brit Ben Abtarim. So the way he did that was by sending Yosef down, and just like a mother would follow her son, and if it's a cow, right, she'd end up plowing if she has a plow on top of her. So Yosef led Yaakov to Mitzrayim. So on the one hand, it highlights the two levels, right? There's the proximate sin that actually leads to it, and then there's the plot that God has in the background. But what's weird about this midrash is that, Yosef, at the end of the story, he uses it as a reason to not be angry at his brothers. And it's very wholesome and happy at some level. But this midrash is really quite sinister, right? It presents God as somewhat malicious, right? Meaning Yosef presents it as benign, right? Like, it's not really the brother's fault because God wanted him to get here. You did it in a bad way, but whatever, God would have done it. But it's not clear from Yosef that God would have done it in a bad way, right? In a painful way. He just would have made sure that he ended up there. It just turned out that it was a bad way. But this midrash almost sets up God as more malicious in that sense. So you do need to ask what exactly the midrash is getting at. Is it really malicious, or is what it's saying is, it's what God is doing is, what God's plans are inexorable, right? It will happen, but God is open to basically, he'd be okay if this would happen in a not bad way, but God is not afraid to basically tempt people to give in to their Yetzer Hara if that's the best way to fulfill his plans through natural human failure. Now, what would have happened if human beings wouldn't have failed? Would God have come up with a different way? Presumably. But God is basically saying, look, this is the end result, and I'm going to let it happen through human means, and one of the ways is I'm going to tempt people. I'm not taking away your free will, but I'm pretty sure of what is going to happen. In the end of the day, it really is, your fault. But what I think this midrash really highlights is right, what we see in Vayechi is Yosef, being the victim, says, I don't blame you for what you did. And maybe what he's saying is not just what we said at the beginning, that, well, you know what, I'm willing to overlook the fact that on a human level, you're the proximate cause, because this is part of a bigger story. It could be more than that based on this midrash, that God often plans to carry out his ultimate plot by setting up human beings for failure. And therefore, Yosef is saying, look, I know that you committed a crime against me, but God had actually made it that Yosef would be favored by Yaakov, and you would get jealous. And yes, you used your own free will, but God set you up that way as a easy way of fulfilling his plot. What that really raises the question is it adds a dimension to Yosef's claim, which is, I don't blame you, because not just was this part of a plot, but even the fact that you failed was set up by God. What it does force us to really ask is the question of free will, right? Which is, the real claimants against God here aren't Yosef. It should be the brothers, which is, why did you set us up for failure? And, there the answer seems to be that God never forces people's hands, right? Like, Adam, in the end of the day, is punished because he does mess up. The woman is divorced because she really doesn't have a great relationship with her husband. And the complex message that the Midrash seems to be getting across is that not only does God have an ultimate plan, But God will often set people up for failure in order to fulfill that plan through sin. He won't force it. And therefore, if you fail, you are at some level responsible. But not only is that failure part of a bigger plan, but the fact that you failed at some level was foreseen, if not forced by God. And that creates a very complex theological vision. But I think it's unescapable that Midrash is trying to add that complexity to understanding the entire story from Vayeshev through Vayechi. Right? Again, not just the benign way that Yosef says it, which is, you may have sinned, but I was going to get here one way or the other, so I forgive you for your sin. But that God actually, as part of his sin, as part of his plan, was willing to utilize the potential of sin, and therefore, even though human beings maintain free will and they'll be punished for what they did, from the perspective of other human beings, they have to realize that at some level, God was setting everybody up, and therefore, it does take a little bit of the anger away, and the Midrash is forcing us in that sense to really grapple with not just the two levels at which history functions, right? The proximate cause and the theological one, but also to remember that the line between free will, right, and us being unwitting pawns in God's plan, and God actually setting us up for failure, but us still utilizing free will, is a complex one, which forces us to deal with issues of free will, but also affects the way we blame the people who committed crimes against us, when at the end of the day, God was actually making that a likely occurrence. So those are some of the theological issues that the Midrash, I think, is adding to complicate the message that you're supposed to see both in the Yosef story, but as the Midrash notes, the same type of question could be asked about Adam with his inevitable sins. So it's really forcing you to realize that this complex theological message is a universal one that really drives much of Tanakh. So that's the thoughts and questions I'll leave you with on this one. In general, I think this week I'll